The first thing that I want to point out here is that the water line in the back up against the clouds is completely horizontal. It's just the angle of the camera that makes it look lopsided. Make sure that your water line is completely straight. If it's a little lopsided, it's going to look really weird. So coming down to the actual wave, you want to look at this more as kind of a mountaintop where it comes up at a peak and then flattens out at the edge. Get a lot of reference photos because that will vary on your wave, but my wave has this peak at the top, and most of the time when I do waves, I paint them this way. Now the upper section is going to be lighter and it's going to fade darker as you come down. That upper peak is raised farther away from the rest of the body of water, and so the light coming through that is what's lightening it up. You can see I made a little bit of a mess when I used the mop brush, and, well, mine's actually a blush brush, but I got paint where it wasn't supposed to go, so I took a clean brush with a bit of water and just wiped that up. You can always fix mistakes with acrylic paint doing this as long as your first layers are 100% dry and you're using a quality paint. That paint that actually accidentally got there, I ended up using as just a part of the background in the water. That ended up working out quite well because I didn't want a lot of detail there anyway. So I could have wiped it off completely if I didn't want it there at all, but because I did need color there anyway, I just left it. Coming back up to my wave, I want that to fade down to the darker shades, so I'm adding a gray tone in with the teal that I've already got. The teal color that I achieved by mixing, I'm using Liquitex Basics, and I mixed bright aqua green with a bit of phthalo blue, and then the white to lighten it up. That paint has sat a bit too long, so it was starting to dry out, which means I wouldn't have been able to blend it. So I used my airbrush with a bit of water just to get it wet again so that I had time to blend. If you're using an airbrush like that for misting water, you can keep your paint wet for hours, so that rush to hurry up and blend before it dries, you can completely eliminate with acrylic paint by using an airbrush. So I'm fading that darker gray up to my teal color or aqua color. Now I'm using a mop brush, which is actually a blush brush. It doesn't shed as much. You guys actually recommended that to me, but I am softening out the details there. I don't need it to be 100% perfectly smooth because I'm going to put the veins from the wave, the sea foam that floats on top, in there anyway. So I just need it kind of smooth. Knowing and understanding when you need to worry about something, like, do I need to worry that that's not 100% smooth? Should I smooth it out? That sort of thing will come with experience. The more that you're painting, the more you're going to learn what you need to be concerned about and what you need to just move on. It doesn't matter. So in this case, like I said, it doesn't matter because I'm going to be hiding a lot of that behind the veins in the wave. So now I'm coming down for the bottom section and adding a lighter gray for the surface of the water. Now this portion is flattened out. The wave itself, the teal, that is raised up, and then the gray that I'm painting right now is where the water's flat again. I'm using a Taklon bristled filbert brush. This is one that I've gotten at Hobby Lobby. They have sales all the time where their Master's Touch, which is their generic brand, go on sale for half off. These brushes are pretty good, especially considering the price. I always stock up when they go on sale. Now for this bottom water section where I'm separating above and underwater, this line doesn't have to be perfectly horizontal like your upper water or skyline. This can be at all sorts of different curves and waves. It just gives more movement to the water. I also don't need this gray section, the part that's flat, to be completely smooth. This will end up being covered by seafoam. And here the brush that I'm using is actually fairly large. You can switch to a smaller brush. Don't feel like you need to use the same size that I'm using. If it's more comfortable for you to work smaller for the smaller detail there, separating above and underwater, that's totally fine. I will come back through with a smaller flat brush to better define those lines. Now, this section of the water can be fairly rough. Like I said, does not need to be smooth, knowing what I'm going to be adding to it later. All of this is a layering process. And now if I was doing this in oil paint, I would do it the same way, but I would be letting each layer dry in between, which takes a lot longer. But if you do everything wet into wet, some of it I would do wet into wet with oil, but if you do everything wet into wet, you can end up creating more of a muddy, blurry mess, and here that's not what I'm going for. Now notice that I'm working horizontally side to side. If I have any brush strokes showing, I do want them to follow the movement of the water, which needs to be horizontal here. And that's one of the things, the biggest mistakes that I see people make when they're doing water, whether it be a stream or a river. They'll put a lot of vertical lines or diagonal lines that are too long, and it makes the water look lopsided. Make sure that your lines, especially the longer ones, are completely horizontal. I'm able to use this one large brush to get smaller detail just by barely letting it touch the canvas. I'm using a very light hand to get those thinner lines. The harder you push with your brush, the thicker the line is going to be. But like I said, you can switch to a smaller brush if that's more comfortable for you. So now I'm letting that area of the paint dry. I can take a hairdryer to it if I want, but I may as well work on another area and save the effort. So this section of the wave, this is where it's curling or crashing down. I need to make sure that my streaks are following that curve. These are not straight lines. Notice that they're slightly rounded. And I'm intentionally going to leave some of those streaks in there to create the movement of the water. Coming back through with a thicker teal. I've got more paint on my brush. My first layer had a fair amount of water, so it was really thin. Now I'm using thicker paint, but this is all still wet. I'm really looking forward to, in the future, having it set up where you guys can see my palette while I'm mixing. Hopefully by the end of this year I'll have a setup for that. So now I'm taking some white. Really it's just white mixed in with the teal. It's not straight white, but it's that lighter teal color, and I'm still following the curve of that water. I'm going to soften that out just a bit, but I'm still leaving some of those streaks. I don't want it to be as smooth as the other portions of the wave. Now starting with the sea foam, the crashing portion of that wave. You may think to paint this white because it's going to need to be white, right? But in order for the whites to really show up, I need to have a darker color on there first. The gray that's on there already is too dark. So I've mixed a bit of gray in with my teal, and anytime I have a color that's grayish, it's just black and white mixed with whatever color I'm working in. And in this case, I'm using Mars Black and Titanium White, both by Liquitex Basics. I don't want to use an ivory black because the ivory black is too translucent, so I'm really not going to get the tone that I want here. I need this to be more opaque. The Mars Black is your opaque black. I save ivory black for doing different shadows and different things like that, but for the most part, Mars Black is my go-to black. But it's the teal color that I had previously mixed, and I stored it in one of those little vials that I talked about in one of my recent email lists. I mixed a lot of the teal color, which was that bright aqua green with phthalo blue. I mixed extra of that because I knew I was going to need it throughout this piece, being that it's only the black, white, and that color in this one. So I put it in one of those little vials and stored it for use here. And in this case, I'm taking that aqua color and mixing in black and white to get this grayish tone for my sea foam. Now I've added a bit of permanent green deep, also by Liquitex Basics, and I'm glazing that over this. Now it looks brighter on the video than the actual color is. It's a deeper green, not so fluorescent, but I needed to add that extra color. Even though I'm sticking with the teal everywhere else, if I don't add that deep green, I'm going to lose a lot of depth in this. My wave is going to feel a bit flat, so by adding that extra color there, it really let it pop more. I'm going to glaze that over some of the water, and by glazing I mean it's mostly water with a bit of paint. You can use a glazing medium. I personally am not here. I don't want, the glazing medium tends to add a bit of gloss, which is not the look that I want, and water works perfectly fine. So deeper green here, that same permanent green deep, I'm just using a little less water so that it stands out more. Using my mop brush to soften that up. When I use the mop brush, I'm only softening out any lines on the inside section that's still wet. Those outer sections up towards the top of the wave, and then the bottom down towards the gray where the water is flat. That's really not going to be softened out by that mop brush at this point because those areas are already dry. So it's only those inner areas that are wet that mop brush will work on. Using that same permanent green deep on my wave. That was stupid. My whole thing I'm painting right now is a wave on the crashing portion of the wave. Now notice as I add this into the water here, again, I'm keeping very horizontal lines. They're very flat. You don't want vertical lines here. You also want to avoid, one thing that I see a lot of people do is the wave type that we do as kids where it's the little peaks where it scoops down and back up, scoops down and back up. That is not what water generally looks like. Even choppy water is going to have a completely different form. So get reference photos. If you've not painted waves a lot, get a good reference photo and copy the movement of that water. You don't want to do the painting type that we did as kids. Using my pink hair dryer. I started using this hair dryer for my canvas because it was frying my hair. It's actually a really expensive hair dryer that was given to me. That thing fries my hair, but it works great for paintings. It gets really hot, so as long as I'm not pushing it too close to the canvas, I can dry my paintings really, really quickly. If you go too close, I could cause bubbling in the paint because it does get so hot. Why I touched the canvas there, I'm just feeling to make sure that the canvas is cooled back down. If it's still very hot, when I start adding more paint, the paint will dry too quickly. So I need to make sure when I use the hairdryer that that canvas is cool before I start painting. Now I'm taking a stiff brush. This one is a stiff round brush that I've added a tiny, tiny bit of water, and I'm using it to blend out that edge between the wet paint and the dry paint below it. If you're using cheap paint, this will cause the previous layers to lift off, but as long as you're using a quality paint, in this case the Liquitex Basics is what I'm using, which I've mentioned way too many times already, that one, the paint won't lift, so I can use that stiff brush, work in little circles, and just soften out that edge. I don't need it perfectly soft because I will be coming back through with the veins, but I do want it softer than what it is now. And I need that upper section, that peak, to really be lighter than the rest, like obviously lighter. Now another option I have here would be to take my airbrush and just wet the area between the dry and the wet paint and then use the mop brush to blend. Why I didn't do that right there, I'm not sure, because it's actually a little bit easier. Now I am using some of the green color, that permanent green deep, mixed with my teal aqua color, and going over some of the shaded areas to add more depth into the splashing section of the wave. I've also got to take a darker gray color for the outside edge of this wave. This is where there will be a little bit of white splashes, or the seafoam look, but if I don't have the dark there, that's not going to show up. So I'm now blocking that in. This can be very loose. I don't have to have perfect shapes here. I'm adding a lighter gray on top of that. You don't want to try to do everything in one perfect color. Layer things. Get different dimension in there. It just creates a lot more to your work. If you try to get the perfect color in every one spot, you end up having something that looks very flat. Layer things. Layer several colors. The more layers you get, the more depth your piece ends up having. So I'm coming back through and brightening up that wave again. I've got a fair amount of water in my brush at that point. Now, quite often I will use a lot of transparent mixing white in my paintings. I didn't on this one though, because I didn't want that blue tint that gives. I have a warmer kind of green teal color going on here, and then the warmer grays, and if I would have used that transparent mixing white, it adds too much blue, which would have killed my full-on black and white feel for the upper section and then the coral, and then just wouldn't have matched well with the teal colors. So here I really stuck with my titanium white when I needed to lighten things up. What I'm doing now, and why I was holding the brush there, is I'm getting ready to start doing the veins in the wave. But I need to get the right shade. It's a grayish tone that I want there for the shadowed areas, but I needed to compare that color up against the water to see if the color I had was right. It was not right, so I'm back to mixing color. I believe that I was too light, so now I'm darkening that up. Now I'm going to come back through and start adding the waves, or the veins in the wave. I'm being very messy. Now, the pattern that you're going to do for these veins matters a lot based on the form of the wave. Like here, the water is lifted up from the water surface. So my lines are going to be more vertical and diagonal. When I get down to the flat section of the water, I've got to switch to where everything's very horizontal. But you really want to watch that, because that's what forms the feel of the wave. If you get those veins in the wrong moving in the wrong direction, it'll make the wave look completely wrong. These veins are what form the movement in the water. So they're one of the most important parts about doing water or waves. Now I'm adding a darker gray over the light color that I had, which gives me 2 tones. I'm using a much smaller filbert brush, but I will end up switching to a flat brush for finer detail later. A round brush is easier for a lot of people as well. And this is something that when you're first starting out with water, pay close attention to your reference photo. I've done this enough now that I don't really have to copy the reference photo exact anymore. I've done hundreds or thousands of waves over my lifetime because this is what I used to specialize in. So I don't follow it that closely, but get the feel for it. Watch your reference photo while you're learning. It is so important to get this movement right. Now for my wave, I have a section that's in shadow. That is the portion where it's brightest on the wave. And then the section that I'm working on now, this has more light hitting it. And so I'm using almost a straight white here. There's a little bit of teal and gray mixed in with it, but it is pretty bright. And the movement is a little bit different here because the wave, the mountain peak looking portion, is actually starting to curve in. So my movement is going to be slightly different there than it is on that long section off to the left of the painting. Now I've switched to that flat brush and I'm working on the flat section of the water. Notice that my lines are sketchy, back and forth. There are diagonal lines, but those diagonal sections are short. I've got short diagonal, long horizontal, short diagonal, long horizontal. Repeat that to yourself when you paint waves or water at all. I can't stress the importance here. This is where I see most people make the mistakes in their water, is that they don't get this movement that I'm doing right now correct. Notice it's long, short, short, long, short, long, short, short, long. It doesn't have to be that pattern as far as how many shorts versus long, but you want to make sure that those horizontal lines are really long. Any diagonal lines are very, very short. That's what's going to make the water look flat. And I mean flat in a positive way. Usually when I say flat, I mean negative. There as a negative way. I can't talk. But here, it's really important. You want to go follow that long horizontal line when doing the flat portions of the water. So back up to the portion of the water that is lifted from the main water surface. You can see here now my shapes are a little bit different. I can have some of those longer vertical lines and then flatten out again to where they're more horizontal as I get down to this flat section. And you don't need to move as fast as I'm going here. Like I said, I have painted hundreds or thousands of waves, probably more thousands of waves. So I've done this enough that I can move through this pretty quickly. Take your time. You're not rushing. And another thing that you may want to do if you're working in acrylics, if you have a white charcoal pencil, Generals makes one that I really like, you can draw in the movement of your water before you start painting. It makes it a little bit easier because that erases really easily and doesn't leave marks on your canvas. But if you draw that in first, it makes it a little easier to handle. Now, portions of this I want to be brighter white, and portions of it I want to have that more grayish tone. So that's what I'm building up here. And there's a good example. The line that I have now, the last one that I did, the horizontal one, it's really long and all the diagonals next to it are very, very short. Now I'm making the shadowed area connect to the highlighted area on that wave. I'll come back through with some brighter colors over it. It's not going to stay that dark gray. Adding the dark gray underneath where that seafoam is going to go, which will give me more dimension later on. Now, I'm not just randomly putting lines all over the place. Watch your reference photo. Check where the shadows go. I'm hyping my shadows up a lot from what my reference photo was, but I'm still putting shadows where they should be on there. Refer back to that as needed. My reference photo comes from Paint My Photo. I'll put a link to the photo that I used in the video description, although at the moment they're still moving the website over and I'm not sure if it's up yet or if you'll be able to see it. But just in case, I'll throw that link down there. And I will cover, most of this is going to get covered with varying lines on top of it later, but the thing to notice here, just follow that direction. Long, short, short, long, short, short. It's very sketchy. And you also don't want all of these lines to be the same width. Vary how much pressure you're adding to the brush. So some areas are thicker and some areas are thinner. There's no rule. It needs to start off thicker and end out thinner or anything like that. It's just that you want variation in there. Very, very important. And not all waves are going to be totally flat where I'm working. So again, check your reference photo. Now let's say you're painting a lake or a river or something like that. The line between your water and the land may be slightly curved. It may curve around, especially if that mass of water is at the front of the painting. It's normal to have it kind of wrap around on those edges. Don't make these lines that I'm doing here follow that curve of the land mass. You want to keep your lines, no matter how that land is around it, these have to stay horizontal. If you follow the line of your land mass, you will end up making your water look warped, which makes your whole painting look weird. So always, always, anytime you put ripples in the water like this, you want to make sure that the main movement there is horizontal. Now, again, of course, if you have choppy water, you're going to have different shapes in there, so that's different. But when you're just doing kind of the calmer lines or ripples in the water, keep those horizontal. The nice thing here, don't be afraid of your paint, like, oh my gosh, I put too many lines. It's going to be kind of choppy here or sketchy, so you can come back through and add darks where they need to be if you go too crazy with your light areas. Just let the paint dry and then paint right over it. Acrylic paint especially is really easy for that because it dries so quickly. Notice that the lines that I'm doing here aren't straight white. There's a little bit of that grayish teal color in there. I will come back through with straight white later, but not yet. First I want these darker tones in. And I am mixing a bit of water in with my Liquitex Basics in order to get the paint to move smoothly here. At no point do I really ever use straight paint with no medium or water mixed in to thin it out. If you're having a hard time where you're getting the little white dots of the canvas showing through, or your lines, you can't get a long straight line, chances are you don't have the paint thinned down enough. Remember, the more water or mixing medium you add to the paint, the less opaque it is. So you're going to make it more transparent. Plus, if you're using water like I am, if you use too much water, you make the paint to where it's not as adhesive, so it doesn't really stick to the canvas very well. So you don't want to overdo that. If it's running and dripping, you've got too much. But I am thinning it down so that it moves nice and smooth. And there's no perfect formula to that because it depends on which area you're working on. That's just going to come with practice. Now I have switched to a script liner. I believe this is a number 4. It's either a 4 or a 3. And this is again one of those Master Touch brushes, the generic brand made by Hobby Lobby. This one is their synthetic hog hair, so it's a little bit stiffer than the Taklon that I often use, which I'm finding that I love for getting fine detail. For years I've always used the Taklon script liners, but I'm starting to lean even for acrylic more and more towards these synthetic hog hair bristles. Just adding that tiny detail. And again, this is where it's important to have variation. If I kept using the same brush, chances are all of my lines were going to be too similar, the width of them all. So this allows me to get more variation. Now, I'm actually editing out most of the pauses in the video where I'm stopping to mix color, so it appears that it's a lot faster than it actually was. I think I spent about 2 hours painting this wave, 2.5 hours, whereas the video is going to be closer to an hour long, so I've edited it a lot out, and I'm making up words now, so it feels like I'm moving faster than I am. But you do not have to rush through this. And I don't want you to feel like I'm moving so fast, so you have to move that fast either, because I'm really not moving as fast as it seems. Now I'm using a mixture of gray, and I'm going right over. I've got water mixed in it, so even though my white and my black are fairly opaque, I've got enough water mixed in with it that it's not completely covering the white that I did earlier. But I do want to start toning down and adding some shadows. Now I'm taking straight white. This paint is a lot thicker so that it really shows up, and I'm going to start going over some of the lines that I already have and pulling out highlights. I don't want to cover everything with this though. I want a lot of those darker areas to still show through. This makes it appear like some of that seafoam is set back further in the water where some of it is sitting more on top. And I'm still keeping those sketchy movements. And making some of these a lot thicker now. Now I could have left it with that much fine detail or thin lines on the seafoam, but what was happening was in the entire piece, it was pulling all of my attention there. It was too much teeny tiny detail. So I needed to thicken up a lot of these lines so that I wasn't pulling attention just to this flat surface of the water. While the wave really is one of my focal points in the painting, I want the wave to be and not this flat portion of the water. That flat portion is important, it needs to be there, but it's also not where I want all of the attention drawn. So I'm breaking up some of these finer, tiny lines, making them larger so that the viewer isn't just drawn right there. My hand is in the way. Adding these thicker lines is also making it appear more like sea foam versus water ripples. I'm coming back through and adding a few highlights onto the shaded area of the sea foam. Again, this section of the water is raised, and so these lines can be more vertical than the horizontal that I keep stressing for the flat portion. Now this brush, this flat brush, it's easier for me to have a little bit more control in the shapes and lines that I'm using. So I usually will use this on top or as one of my last brushes when I'm doing something like this. And that brush is actually another one of the Master's Touch, the generic Hobby Lobby brands, and they discontinued this one. And I'm so sad because it's double-ended. It has a round end on one side and then the flat end that I'm using here. And I love this thing. I bought it on clearance, and of course, because it was on clearance, they don't make it anymore, but it is the most convenient brush in the world to use, having the two ends like that. I really need to find more of those. Obviously not made by Hobby Lobby since theirs are discontinued, but they are really nice. And notice how many tones are in here now, varying shades from white, gray, teal gray, darker teal gray. There's just so many in there, and that is really, really important in creating this look. If I just did all of this flat white or a light gray tone, it's not going to have the depth that it does by adding layer on top of layer on top of layer. And what's happening is when I'm working on top of a previous layer like I am now, I'm still letting some of those darker colors show through. I'm not trying to cover all of them up. That's important. This is an area that you want to pay attention to where you're putting your highlights or the whites, because that can actually control where the viewer's eyes are going as well. Here it's kind of even for me across the whole bottom section, but depending on what your design is, that is something that you can use to your advantage if you're trying to move the viewer's eye in a certain direction. Pulling these highlights on the wave in the right area can really help you with that. Okay, now it is time for the fun part, adding the actual splashing sea foam. I'm using a very stiff brush. There is not a ton of paint on here. It's mostly the paint, very, very little water, and I'm partially dabbing or stabbing at the canvas with this, but part of it, notice that I'm putting the pressure down and then moving the brush forward, so it's kind of sliding forward while the back end of the brush stays put. I need to do a tutorial on just how to do that because it's also how you can do easy trees and bushes, so that will be coming in the near future. But I'm creating the clumps and bunches of sea foam there. You don't just want a bunch of polka dots, and that's a mistake I see happen a lot where people just randomly stab the canvas all over. I'm creating clumps in here of where that sea foam is formed so that it has that rolling movement. You can really see now why it was important for me to have those darker grayish teal colors underneath where this is going to go. Now here I'm just lightly dabbing this smaller section. But again, that gray has to show through, so that's why I had that dark gray on there first. But I'm not adding a lot of pressure. I don't want this to be really thick like the other portion of the wave. And I've got to make sure that these are overlapping and that I'm getting variation in here. If it looks like polka dots, it is wrong. And I don't often say something's completely wrong in a painting, but when you're doing trees or bushes, or in this case sea foam, if everything looks like polka dots, it doesn't look right. I've got a little bit less paint on my brush and I'm getting some of the splashes. Dabbing that with my finger helps to break up the pattern there so it's not too uniform. You can see on a lot of this I'm not just dabbing. Some of it I am, and some of it I'm almost pushing the brush. I'm not sliding the brush. The back end of the brush stays still, but the front end pushes forward, which creates those little separate dots at the front end of that. Again, that will be a separate tutorial, which definitely need to do soon. Now, I don't want to leave these waves looking too solid, so I've got a brush that has a bit of thinned down white paint so that it splatters easily, and a palette knife. And I am just flicking that paint onto the canvas by pulling the palette knife towards me. I also use this technique to get stars. Some people will use a toothbrush, that works well too, and use your own finger to flick the paint. I personally prefer this method. My arm is in the way. Again, flicking on this section too. I'm reloading my brush right now. Again, that paint has a fair amount of water on it, but I don't want the paintbrush to be really wet. So I will usually mix a thinned down version of that white paint and then dab it onto the brush separately so that the paintbrush itself doesn't get wet. If that paintbrush is really soaking wet, it won't flick the paint right. You want that brush to be stiff and dry. So this is a case where one of my more damaged brushes works better because I want that really, really stiff feel. What I'm doing right now, you can't really see, but I had flicked some of those white dots where I didn't want them, so I've got a clean brush with water on it, and I'm just lifting some of those spots out where I got a little carried away with the flicking. So I'm going to flick more of that paint. This is a case where less is more, or at least start with less. Doing too much too early on, it's a little bit harder to fix. So do less than you think you need and slowly add more as you go. And test this on another piece of paper or something, just a board, anything else. Make sure that you've got a feel for how to flick this paint because it can get out of hand and go everywhere really easily if you've not done it before. I've switched over to that hog hair bristled liner brush, or synthetic hog hair, and I'm adding the finer detail on the curve of the wave there. And this is another area where I don't want every single line to be the same thickness, the same length. I want variation in here. And so you can see I'm using a very shaky hand. Pretend you had way too much caffeine to get that natural look. Or you could do like me and actually drink way too much caffeine. So shaky hands are a good thing here. And if you do like what I just did there, I had a mark that I made way too thick. I just dab it with my finger. That's one thing that I really like with the acrylics, being that they are non-toxic. It doesn't matter if I get them on my skin. If you are painting with oils, I do not recommend using your finger to dab the paint unless you're wearing gloves, because some of that is very toxic and you don't want it coming into contact with your skin, especially a lot of the whites that have lead in them. But with acrylic, we're safe. Now I'm following the curve there. Any of the lines that I put, I need them to be curved. You do not want this to look straight. If it looks straight, then your wave will instantly look flat. I'm also coming through now and doing tiny little dots and squiggles for some of this. With this brush, I've got a lot more control than I do by flicking paint. And so here's where I'm adding those highlights and those shiny marks with more control than I would have by flicking. This also makes it look more shiny and sparkly. Now I need to create more depth in that foam. I don't want it to stay as flat as I've gotten. So I've got a glaze of a mixture of the deep, what was it, deep green? No, permanent green deep, I don't know, one of those. But I've got that mixed in with a bit of the turquoise and gray color, and I'm adding some shadows into that sea foam. I do not have a lot of white mixed in with this because the white would make it too opaque, so this glaze would not work. Dabbing with my finger to tone down areas that I got too dark. But you don't want your seafoam to just be solid white. So not only do I have the dark areas that I initially did show through some of these white portions, I'm going back through and adding shadows on top of different areas. And this is a thing too, I don't want to put the shadows over all of it. I want some of that white to really shine and show through. And areas that I got too dark, I can come back through and highlight again with the white. The bottom section, I definitely want shaded more. This would be another example where I'm using my finger to dab. Don't do that if you're working in oil. Not a good habit to get into. Now the undersection of these need to be shadowed. You can see, because this is a glaze and it's very transparent, you can still see the detail of the white marks that I did underneath it. I'm not completely covering everything up. Adding some of that glaze underneath the wave here. I'm going right over some of the white areas. This is another thing. I'm going to start off going lighter than I think I need to go and then keep adding darker colors as needed. I've switched to a smaller version of that large stiff round brush that I used earlier so that I can get some more definition on some of these waves. I'm using straight white paint here. I am letting it be very, very bright. And I'm dabbing it into clumps, not polka dots. Can't stress that enough. No polka dots. If you have polka dots, you're doing something wrong. Wipe it off and try it again. And if you need to wipe an area off, if you're using good paint, just use a bit of water on a clean brush, wet the area, and then wipe that section off and redo it. Now, how hard I push with this brush will also determine how thick each of those little dots comes out. So most of this I'm not pushing very hard. If I do, I can wipe it off like I just did. Now remember, when you're using these stiff round brushes, do not submerge the whole brush into water. You don't want this to be wet. If it gets really wet, it makes the bristles very, very soft and they bend. We want this to be very stiff. So if you need to mix water into your paint, use a separate brush for that and then switch over to this so it stays very stiff and very dry. And for this technique, I definitely prefer a brush that's been a bit damaged. I haven't cleaned real well so that it's even more stiff. When you add the sea foam like I'm doing here, be very, very careful not to overdo it, because this is something that if you get too crazy and just put white blobs everywhere, you can kind of ruin the whole feel of the wave that you worked so hard on up to this point. So this is another thing. Practice it on a separate piece of paper before you do it on your actual project, just in case. Make sure you have a good understanding of how to get that look with these clumps of water waves or splashes. I'm using a slightly lighter section or color with the bright aqua green and teal mix with some water to pull out the highlights on that wave even more. I really want to make sure that light section of the wave pops. I've switched back to my Taklon bristled filbert brush, a smaller one, and I'm adding or better defining the shadows underneath that wave. By making sure that those shadows are there, I'm going to push that water or make it really stand out where the sea foam is crashing up. For the shadow under the wave there, I've added a bit of water in with my black paint so that it's fairly transparent. You're still seeing the detail underneath it, it's just shadowed. I'm pulling out some more shadows on other areas as well, just to darken them up a bit. And this is just creating the contrast between my light and my dark areas so that my light areas really pop out more. Right there, I had gotten a little bit of that gray onto my teal color of underwater, so I just took a clean brush with a bit of water and wiped that off. because the paint that's underneath it was completely dry. That worked out just fine. Now that everything is pretty much blocked in, this is where I just come through and start refining details. Brightening things up that need it, softening things up that need it. I will continuously back away from the canvas and look at it from a distance or upside down to double check if any areas are highlighted or too bright, drawing attention to an area that I don't really want. If you don't regularly back up away from your work, you should start doing that, because it really makes a difference in being able to notice things that you didn't notice when you were right up close to it. And take all the time that you need to finish a piece. Don't worry about overworking it. I hear this so often. Artists are so worried about overworking a piece. It is so rare that an artist overworks something. More often than not, they just don't finish the piece. That's the problem, not that they overworked it. So if your piece doesn't look exactly how you want it to right now, spend more time working on it. Now I'm coming through, there were a few kind of dots randomly where I didn't want them in the water, and so here's where I can smooth those out with this brush. And those dots happened because of the way that I do the sketchy line. I end up with little hot spots, so I can soften those out now. This is where I really need to watch the movement of my brush so that everything's nice and clean, because this is the section of the painting where I'm cleaning everything up. So some of those lazy practices I have early on in the piece, I cannot use now. I'm also making sure that any areas that were dry brushed where I have little dots of the previous color underneath showing through, I'm cleaning up. And usually that's because you don't have enough paint or enough water on your brush when you get that dry brushed look. The movement here is still following that long line, long horizontal, short vertical, long horizontal pattern that I did earlier. One of the things that you can do if you're learning that movement, the long line, short vertical, long horizontal line, practice doing it with just a piece of paper and a pencil. Get the hang of drawing the water out. That way can make it a little bit easier. Because when you start adding paint, that's just one more element that makes it harder to learn the movement there. So just practicing on a piece of paper, really, really helpful. Now I want this section of the wave, those veins need to be in shadow, but they don't need to be quite as dark as I had them. And here I've actually got them too light, so I'll come back through and add darks on top again, but I'll have sections where they're a little bit lighter and a little bit darker, and I get more variation in doing the layers like this. And one of the reasons that I jump around so much like this is once I get the contrast built up everywhere else, it makes it easier for me to learn or to look back and see what areas need more work or need to be brighter or darker. So I do a lot of jumping around when I'm painting because of that. I'm now into the very final stages of painting this wave, where at this point I am glazing some darker colors with that permanent green deep hue mixed with some of the teal and black to get that gray form or gray shade, and I'm going in between some of these areas with the white seafoam portions and darkening these up. I'm going to go over a lot of these and then pull back out white on top of it just for that final bit of depth. The wave at this portion, the sea foam that's splashing up, it appears to be really white. I didn't actually go back and whiten that up anymore. It's just that the way the light is hitting the canvas right now. So that portion hasn't changed at all. I'm glazing some of this dark color over the veins in the wave, and I'm not being real careful trying to stay inside the line. I don't care if some of this goes outside the edge. It actually looks better because it just creates a little bit more detail where that glaze has gone outside of the line of those veins. A little bit more shading on the wave there that you can't really see because the way that the glare is. I apologize for that. Pulling out a bit more white on some of that sea foam. I've got a little bit of water mixed in with my titanium white. What I'm trying to do here is soften my edges, the transition between my lights and my darks on some of that sea foam, because some of it is a lot harsher than I want. So by taking that white over all of it, I create a more fuzzy, foggy look. And while I don't normally glaze titanium white, here it actually works for the look that I'm going for. Now I've got thicker white. There's very, very little white water mixed in with the white here. I really want this to stand out. And all those little details that I did earlier, while they're subtle, they're still there. Painting over them the way that I didn't lose them. I didn't waste time in doing them. They still show. They're just pushed really far back, and so it's very, very subtle. When you look at the piece, you don't look at it and see tons of tiny detail, even though it's really there. This helps to create a bit more depth in my water. I'm holding that filbert brush to the side so that I can get thin lines. You can see I'm going through, and a lot of these lines that I have kind of sketched in there, I'm connecting them so that they're not just random single floating lines. Now at this point, I felt that my water was just kind of, the whites were standing out a bit too much. So I'm glazing a muddy gray green color over it, and then I'll pull a few highlights out on top. But because it's a glaze, lots of water, very little paint, I'm still keeping the detail that I've already done. Nothing's wasted at this point. But that softened everything down, because when I stood back, I felt like a lot of this was just pulling me to the wrong area of the painting. This wasn't what I wanted my focus to be. While this area is very important that it be done correctly, it wasn't where I wanted the viewer to really stop and focus on. So I softened it down, and now I'll have to come back through with white highlights on top of that, but be a little bit more sparing with those highlights. So now you'll see that I'm not making these white highlights as thick as they were before. I'm just putting them on the center section of what's currently there. This is very similar to how I do the shine or the water reflecting, the light reflecting on dolphins and whales. I will have a highlighted area that's fairly thick, but it's not too white, and then I keep the white areas for the center section of those, just to pull out little areas of that. That makes no sense, does it? Less talking, more painting. You can see these highlighted areas. They're inside those lighter gray areas. And I've really got to focus on what movement I'm doing here. That long, short, short, long. And if you have a layer that you're like, this looks terrible, don't feel like it's wasted to put another layer on top. Each one of those layers just builds more depth. Those bad layers add to your final good finished product. Which goes back to not feeling like you're overworking something by continuously messing with it. Yeah, some of my previous layers had looked better, they got worse, then they got way better. So it's just a layering process. Keep layering until it looks good. If you're working in oil, you do need to let those layers dry in between layers in order not to end up with mud. You can see here with the white, I am not putting it everywhere. What I'm doing here is defining that edge where those veins of seafoam there are in shadow versus where the light's hitting them stronger. Now, a lot of the areas that I do for my final little seafoam, I'm more dabbing and dotting and getting more of a rough look there than I did on the previous straight lines. Just on areas that I want to pull out. So I've got more of those squiggles, but it's important when you do that that they be random. It's so easy to do uniform lines and uniform dots and squiggles all over the place, and those don't look good at all. It ends up looking like confetti. So make sure that you have a very random look. That having a shaky hand is great for this. This is a stage where you also want to drink too much caffeine. And when you're first learning to draw waves or paint waves, chances are they're not going to have a perfectly natural look to it. Don't let that discourage you and think, oh, I'm terrible at waves, I'm never doing this again. My first waves were horrible. This just takes learning the movement of the water, and that you're only going to get from practice.